You are watching India Global with me, Parmeshwar, Bawa on the NDTV network. India and China relations this week have faced yet another storm, with the two sides clashing over China issuing a new map. All this and more lined up for you on this episode. The headlines first. A new China map draws more rejection after India lodges strong protest with China. Absurd claims, says External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar. Meanwhile, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan and Vietnam reject China's map, calling it baseless. Russian President Vladimir Putin dials Prime Minister Modi, expresses inability to attend the G20 summit in New Delhi and deputes his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to take his place. Meanwhile, media reports suggest China's President Xi Jinping too may skip the G20 summit. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen heads to New Delhi for the G20 summit as worries mount over Beijing. This will be her fourth visit to India in less than a year. Is India on track to replace China for US investment and supply chains? That's the big question. African Union suspends Gabon's membership after a military coup. The president has been placed under house arrest as the military chief has been appointed the leader. Well, our big focus, less than a week after Prime Minister Modi met the Chinese President Xi Jinping, briefly on the margins of the BRICS summit, Beijing is back to a familiar pattern of provocations. On the 28th of August, Beijing released a new map showing occupied Aksai Chin, Arunachal Pradesh, and other parts of Indian territory as part of China. The External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar described the claims as absurd, but Beijing moves will test Indian diplomacy now. While China responded that it was a routine exercise of sovereignty and urged India not to overreact, India has lodged a formal protest with China. But with elections approaching, with the opposition unsurprisingly accusing the Prime Minister's government of weakness against China, it would be tempting for the Prime Minister, as well as his team, to raise the temperature with their own rhetoric against China. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, in an exclusive interaction at NDTV's G20 conclave, said China has a habit of releasing such maps. And in fact, he added that China is merely including other countries' territories in its maps. It means nothing. Listen in.
जिस तरीके से G20 का अभी तक कन्वर्सेशन चला है, उसमें जॉइंट कम्युनिके कितना फिजिबल लगता है, खास करके तब जबकि ठीक इसके पहले चाइना फिर एक मैप रिलीज करके जिसको कहते हैं इरिटेशन खड़ा करना, वो कोशिश कर रहा है कि अक्साई चिन, अरुणाचल उसका पार्ट है। हम बहुत माइंडफुल हैं इस बात के लिए कि G20 इकोनॉमिक कोऑपरेशन का एजेंडा है और वहाँ हमको साइड ट्रैक नहीं होना चाहिए। फिर भी ये चाइना ओवरहैंग तो जाने वाला नहीं है।
Look, China has even in the past put out maps which claim the territories which are not China's, which belong to other countries. This is an old habit of theirs. So just by putting out a map claiming territories, some of which are part of India, I think doesn't make that. These are very much part of India. This government is very clear about what we need to defend our territories. You can already see that on our borders. I think there should be no doubt about that. Just making absurd claims doesn't make other people's territory yours. Let's be very clear on that.
And joining us on the show for further clarity, Professor Kishore Mehbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute, and the author of Has China Won? Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on India Global. Events this week have served as a reminder of the currently low levels of trust as far as China is concerned. Would you say India-China relations are arguably at their lowest since the normalization of ties back in 1980?
Well, I think certainly China-India relations are going through a very challenging phase. I would say the low point was after the clashes in June 2020 at the border. I think since then, as you know, there have been several rounds of talks and been some improvement in the discussions on the border. But still, there's no doubt that India-China relations remain troubled. But at the same time, both India and China are expected by the rest of the world to also play their role as global leaders. People expect India and China to be global leaders. And if you want countries to be global leaders, you got to manage your relations in such a way that you look at the whole global picture, what's important globally, and how you disagree on some areas, but still continue to collaborate on other areas. And I think overall, India and China are doing a reasonable job of managing that quite well.
Right. Professor Mehbubani, what are the biggest misconceptions about China as far as international politics is concerned, as per you?
Well, I think it's important to understand, I think for the Indian audience to understand, that the biggest geopolitical contest in the world is not between India and China. The biggest geopolitical contest in the world is always that between the world's number one power, which today is the United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And the main contest that is rocking the world is the US-China contest. And I think many people were hoping that each G20 meeting will lead to reductions of US-China tensions. I can tell you that last year, for example, just before the G20 meeting in Bali, the president of Indonesia, President Jokowi, invited me for breakfast 2 days before the G20 meeting. And I told President Jokowi of Indonesia that if Indonesia can organize a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, the world would thank him a lot. And President Jokowi said to me, "Oh, don't worry. We have given them the nicest room in Bali." Bali, as you know, is a Hindu island. I must emphasize that. We've given them the nicest room in Bali. And as a result of that, as you know, President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping had a very good meeting in Indonesia. And that's why the G20 meeting in Indonesia has been deemed by most people to be one of the more successful meetings. And I'm still hoping very much that that President Xi will attend the G20 meeting, and that there will again be a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, because the rest of the world, and it's important to emphasize, has got much larger problems to deal with, right? We have climate change, we have potential global recession, we have the Ukraine war, we have many burning issues in the world, and if the leaders don't meet, then the world gets more troubled.
Right. Also, Professor, the rise of China has created a situation where most countries want to maintain economic access to its large market, but also do not want to be politically dominated by China. How do you read the situation?
That's absolutely right. I think nobody wants to be politically dominated by any country in the world. I mean, whether United States, China, Russia, Germany, France. We don't want to be dominated by any country. But at the same time, countries, the main priority for most countries in the world is economic growth and development. And if you don't get access to the Chinese market, you cannot grow and develop. Let me give you one simple statistic so you understand what I'm talking about. Now, Singapore is part of ASEAN, 10 countries ASEAN. Now, in the year 2000, US trade with the 10 countries in ASEAN was $135 billion, and China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion, right? US trade 135, China for 40. But by 2022, last year, US trade had grown significantly from 135 to 440 billion, but China's trade with ASEAN had grown from 40 billion to $975 billion. Now, that's the world's largest trading relationship. I think many people in India know that ASEAN is a group of developing countries, except for Singapore, maybe. But despite that, we have a larger trading relationship with China than Europe does with the United States of America. These are economic giants. So for ASEAN countries, growth comes from trade. And in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN. Now it's only 1.5 times larger. So you can see how in the ASEAN countries, the way that they've grown so much is by opening themselves up to trade with China, despite the fact, and I must emphasize this, ASEAN countries have differences with China also on the South China Sea.
Like
we have differences.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Mehbubani, for joining us on NDTV. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Beijing has sought to enhance the world's dependence on its economy and leverage it for strategic benefit. Well, the foreign minister also underscored the need to dehyphenate India and China. Meanwhile, India shouldn't be seen as China plus one. This is what Dr. S. Jaishankar told NDTV. Listen in.
I don't think India should be depicted as a China plus one. I don't think you're being fair to yourself. I would say countries will invest in India, we ourselves will invest in India when we actually show our capability, our competitiveness. What quite honestly happened earlier was it was almost as though we had given up on manufacturing. Now in the last decade, you've seen a different direction. You've seen a conscious effort at creating the requisite infrastructure, and you've seen an overall easier to make it do business climate. The world will come to India, not because India is a China plus one, but because India has the capacities and the capability, the international credibility and the capability which will make us a good destination, and I think that is happening. So today I do feel there is a big opportunity for us because why is the opportunity? One, the world wants more supply chains. The world wants business to be business. It's sensitive about, how business is handled politically by various states. I think all those things work in our favor today.
Meanwhile, India's trade with China is important because for the last 15 years, China has been India's top source of imports. Now, to take a closer look at India's intriguing trade ties with China, we have with us Michael Kugelman, South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman, for joining us on NDTV. We've just heard the Foreign Minister say the world will come to India, not because India is a China plus one, but because India has the capacities and the capability as well as international credibility. Is there now a certain sense of pessimism about China's economic prospects? Do you think India seems to have become the new destination for capital and technology flow?
Well, look what just happened with India recently. India recently staged a lunar landing on the south pole of the moon. No country has done that successfully before. So I think that's a nice reflection of the type of technological and scientific capacities that India has. But indeed, more broadly, this is a moment when we have a number of major companies, particularly tech companies, that are increasingly concerned about basing production in other facilities in China and are indeed looking to pivot to India. So India certainly has an opportunity, and in the case of a company like Apple, India showed that it has that ability to drive some of these major global tech firms away from China and over to India. Certainly it has a lot of work still to do, but we're starting to see some signs of success already.
Right, there's no denying that China has made impressive progress on some technologies that can replace labor. But if you have a look at the total factor productivity, which includes labor and capital, it has been declining for China. Isn't it far from clear whether tightening party and state control of the private sector will help solve this problem?
Well, look, we know that China has managed to enjoy significant levels of economic success despite being a closed society and authoritarian state for so many years. And, its economy continues to be strong. It has experienced some slowdowns, looking at some slumping in the real estate sector, for example. But, the economy remains strong. But, I do think that, recent developments in China have, I think, made India a much more attractive partner. But, pardon me, let me rephrase that. Recent developments in China have made India seem like a more attractive destination for many major Western companies and companies from around the world. But let's also be very clear. I think that India is really a winner here from great power competition, and particularly U.S.-China competition. You have a lot of major companies and entities from the West that are increasingly uncomfortable engaging with China and wanting to really engage more with India, which I would argue that many countries and many companies in the West view as a key player in this broadening effort to try to counter Chinese power, including Chinese economic power.
In fact, Mr. Kugelman, Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, had said the government welcomed investment from China and trade with China boomed to record levels in 2020 and 2021, led by imports of Chinese machinery. Now, at the same time, the Indian government has banned more than 200 Chinese apps, including TikTok. How does one decipher this relationship?
I think you've hit on an important point. It really is not realistic to think that India and many other countries around the world, including the U.S., can decouple themselves economically from China. China is such a critical trade and investment partner for so many countries, including countries that see themselves as competitors and rivals to China. And indeed, you're right that India has banned dozens, hundreds of Chinese apps, and of course this pattern started after that terrible border clash 3 years ago. But that's pretty much it. We have not seen other efforts on the part of New Delhi to try to punish the Chinese economy and to try to distance India from the Chinese economy. And indeed, if you look at trade figures for the last year, we see that China continues to be one of India's top trade partners. I think you could also look at that as a very useful model to show that countries that are competitors and rivals and have fought wars against each other and have border clashes, they could still manage to find ways to get along through some degrees of commercial cooperation, which is happening with China and India. And, we've also seen that though it causes tension sometimes, China and India are able to coexist within a number of multilateral organizations, whether you're talking about the BRICS, or you're talking about the G20, or you're talking about the SCO. So it's a very complex relationship for sure. But for me, how I see it is that despite strategic competition, despite security tensions, despite mistrust, the two countries find ways to get along enough that they could engage in trade and cooperate commercially, which has really, I think, created a lot of benefits and advantages for both countries.
Just picking up on what you touched upon, Beijing has sought to enhance the world's dependence on its economy and also leverage it for strategic benefit. But for many, it may be tempting to claim that the end of China's growth miracle has begun. What's your take? Can countries afford to decouple from China?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to count China out, so to speak. This is a country, I would argue, that's been able to defy a lot of predictions about its impending slowdown or demise as a strong economy. It continues to be front and center on the global economic stage. Now, certainly you could look to some major challenges that China is going to face, such as its demographics and aging population, which raises questions about labor economy and the number of workers in the coming years. These are things that certainly have to be worked out, and obviously the authoritarian state that China has been for so long, I think inhibits certain types of economic policies, such as more liberalization that could help make the economy more resilient. But I think that it's way too early to be talking about the end of the Chinese economic story, economic miracle, whatever you want to call it. I go back to what I said before. I don't really think there's any country in the world that is seriously entertaining the idea of decoupling itself economically from China. It's just not possible to do, given how entrenched it is, how much clout it has in the investment and the trade context. And you look at these new and emerging technologies that have become so critical for the global economy, like semiconductors. Well, China is right out there, a really big player in that. So I really think that it would be premature to count China out as an economic player and a key economic player. That will continue for quite some time, I believe.
Thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, for joining us on NDTV. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Now, while many countries are not at ease with over-dependence on China for their imports, China continues to be a key trading partner for diverse countries across the world. India is no exception. Now, joining us to decipher the path ahead, Derek Grossman, Senior Defense Analyst at the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Grossman. Now, you've said on record that New Delhi has been mostly successful in pushing back against Beijing's rising influence across the region. You highlighted that India is no longer losing and may even be winning its strategic competition with China in the region. Tell us more about this conclusion you've drawn.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And so when you look across South Asia, and my piece particularly looked at the smaller and medium-sized countries that are kind of getting caught in the middle of increasing China-India competition, whether it's Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, or Sri Lanka, what you find is that there are certain factors at play here that benefit India a lot. To be frank, a lot of it is the result of internal domestic politics within each of these countries that have elected governments more supportive of India than of China. But India has also competed valiantly against China when it comes especially to economic projects that tend to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative in places like Bangladesh in particular. But of course, you have to consider China's relationship with Pakistan continues to be to strengthen, and so that is kind of an outlier in my analysis. But even there, India-Pakistan relations have not gotten significantly worse, and so that is a victory of sorts for India.
Right. China is also experiencing what many would say is a rare period of falling prices as consumer and business demand weakens. A prolonged property market slump in China, plunging demand for exports, and subdued consumer spending are weighing on the economy's recovery. Now, Mr. Grossman, many are under the impression that China is feeling more unsure of itself, and many feel that India has proved to be adept and agile in advancing its interests. How do you perceive it?
Yeah, I think that China's mounting economic woes are certainly going to, and already have had an effect on its standing on the international stage. But, you know, that said, this is a long-term game here, right? And so China is still dealing, I think, with the after effects of COVID lockdowns, strict COVID lockdowns within its country. It's also dealing with the United States in concert with India and other like-minded allies and partners kind of collectively shutting China out of certain sectors of the economy by trying to redirect supply chains and things like that. And so there are a number of things that are going on the economic side that are going to have a big impact on China's ability to be economically strong, right? But China is also working to improve its ability to operate economically without dependence on the West, right? There's been a big push for many years within China to pursue indigenous innovation technologies, right? And so, you know, we'll see how this plays out. Again, this is a longer term game, but at least for now, you know, China's economic vitality, I think, is in question. And that alone is going to cause some uncertainty in the international system.
Right. As we wrap, do you endorse that New Delhi needs to find ways of pushing back that serve as a deterrent to Beijing, whether it's strengthening India's military positions along the border or bolstering intelligence cooperation with partners like the United States?
I do, yes. I think that India, I mean, what's clear from the Doklam standoff in 2017 or the more recent Galwan Valley clashes in 2020 is that China is looking at the disputed border, the line of actual control, and thinking that it could potentially seize more territory there if India is not paying attention. And India, of course, is perfectly capable of conducting operations along the LAC on its own, but it never hurts to have friends in high places, so to speak, to help you out and to bolster deterrence. And so I think that makes sense going forward. I mean, especially you mentioned, you know, on intelligence collaboration, it's clear that from reporting that we've seen that the United States at times has supported the Indian military by providing intelligence. And so, those
Right.
types of things are kind of an augmenting factor in India's ability to conduct operations there and elsewhere.
Well, it's always a pleasure to hear your views, Derek Grossman. Thank you so much for joining us on NDTV.
Thanks. Take care.
That's all we could pack in this episode of India Global. Thank you so much for investing your time and watching. Goodbye.